Hello and welcome to Let the Bird Fly, a podcast about living freely in a world given back to us. Today we're going to be talking about stepping outside the fortress, engaging those with whom we might not agree on everything, and yet those whom we still would love to have conversation. We're glad to have you with us here today as you join us for our conversation and look forward to working through our main topic. I'm joined here in our studio, aka my office today, with our producer, engineer, computer janitor, Ben Lyer, as well as my splendidly bearded co-host, Peter Hermanson. Also visiting with us today are four of my children, Nicholas, Isaiah, who we call Ziggy, Anna, and Sophia. In episode 3, we had the privilege to talk with Pastor John Bordelin about Holy Week, and Sophia had prepared an answer to a question that I told her I would ask her, and so right off the bat, because I am a repentant father seeking his daughter's forgiveness, Sophie, I would like to ask you, this will air after Holy Week, but perhaps you can still remind us what Holy Week is about, and so my question for you, what is your favorite part of Holy Week?
Good Friday, because Jesus died to take away our sins so we can go to heaven forever.
Very good. We appreciate that insight, and what a wonderful reminder from Sophia Johnston, our visitor today, and obviously our growing, budding theologian. As we get started, I'd like to start, as we usually do, with our disclaimer. This show doesn't speak for our church bodies or our employers. To be honest, much of the time it probably doesn't speak for us. We'll be thinking out loud a lot. Approach what you hear with a healthy skepticism, because as a responsible resident of planet Earth, that's pretty much the way to go about almost everything. If you find yourself getting too worked up, tune out, look around, and realize you were just listening to a podcast. Yes, a podcast. Go live free, friends, and don't let us get in the way as you let the bird fly. Our scripture narrative today, which usually helps us get a little bit launched into our main topic, is focused on the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 17, as Paul addresses the Areopagus. Last time for Holy Week, we read our reading from Mark 16, but usually we're just going to talk about it a bit, and so I'll be summarizing it for you. But in that chapter of Acts, we see the Apostle Paul has made his way to Athens, which was really the cultural and intellectual center for the known world for centuries. And he makes his way there, and he goes to the Areopagus, where people would gather to discuss religious and philosophical ideas, weighty stuff. It was a place that was built that existed for conversation. Paul went into that gathering of people who surely did not agree with him, and yet he went and he listened, and he did his best to learn to speak their language in order to engage them in thought. This shows us also that Paul had stepped outside the fortress, that Paul was familiar with much of the thought of the day, not only Jewish religious thought, but also Roman thought in general. He had been a very educated man. And so as he goes, he sees a number of statues there dedicated or inscriptions to various gods. And the Athenians had wanted to cover their bases in case there was one god they had missed, which is a very understandable thing to want to do. And so they had a inscription, an altar, for an unknown God. And Paul saw in this an opportunity. He says, this is very good that you have this altar for this unknown God, and I've got good news for you. I know who he is. And they get into a wonderful conversation as Paul explains the truths of the Christian faith, and does so as best he was able, explaining that his God is not just a God, but the God and the creator of all things. We know the conversation went well for quite some time, but eventually it hits a little bit of a hiccup when Paul mentions the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. For the Greeks, this was a very difficult thing to understand. They couldn't imagine mind and matter and spirit all being things that were going to be stuck together for all eternity. They saw spirit, at least many of them saw spirit as being higher than matter or the body. The body was something to get away from. He certainly, though, stirred the curiosity of a number of the men, and even those who disagreed with him could no longer say that they hadn't heard this message of what the Christian faith teaches or believes. As someone who teaches at a Christian college, I sometimes like to point out to my students that if I can achieve anything as a theology professor, I hope that it's at the end of 4 years, even if they disagree with us, they at least know what real Christianity is, which is not as easy as it sounds, because sometimes there's people who are more confusing about Christianity than Christians. It's about Jesus Christ risen from the dead for our justification. And so in our episode today, which we'll be getting to after our free-for-all, we'll be discussing just that. How do we step outside the fortress? And Peter and I and Ben, as he would like to jump in, will be discussing some of the thinkers we've appreciated and some of the ways engaging the thoughts of those outside of the fortress has not only provided insight for us and driven us deeper into the Christian faith, but also how it's given us the ability to engage those around us, and not always in a creepy, I'm trying to convert you sort of way. I'm not very good at that myself, I know. But in a way that we can sit down and have meaningful conversations, and what we have to say about this with Christianity and philosophical thought or other things applies to about any area of life. If you've gone into the comments on articles on Facebook or any social media, you know how conversation can get today. We can extrapolate this and apply it to how we discuss, how we get along with those who disagree politically, about sports, or about anything else. So, together we will plunge into our next session and do our best to keep it from getting too heated as we engage each other with our potential disagreements.
Well, we're back here for our free-for-all. The most important topics of the day are discussed right here. And today we've got a one that touches each and every one of us as you sit here listening to us. Hopefully on your phone or your iPod. Do they still make iPods? Or your computer. And that is the age-old question, or at least a few decades-old question: which is better, PC or the Mac? Or perhaps the derivative question, although maybe shouldn't be directly derivative, but the derivative question, iPhone or Android? So to start us off, we have Mr. Ben Lehrer, the computer janitor. He knows a thing or two about all computing platforms that are common out there. And so give us your thoughts, Mr. Lehrer.
Well, surprisingly, as somebody who works with computers each and every day as part of my living, I actually do not have a strong stance on this. I've had to work with a lot of platforms and come to appreciate things about each and not appreciate things about each. I personally am a both Mac and PC user. I have both. I currently have an iPhone, but my last 3 or 4 phones have been Android, and I don't think I switched so much out of conviction. It was just time for a new phone, and
it didn't blow up or anything.
Yeah, exactly. The iPhone came with a nice feature of not starting my house on fire, and the current flagship Android phone at the time did not come with that feature. So that was maybe a choice not made by any kind of conviction, but just what I prefer. Certainly see that the Apple ecosystem is very easy to use because it's so closed, but of course with that comes added expense and sometimes the ability to not play nice with other technologies, which is partially the point, to get you to invest in the whole family of products. With the more open platforms, Windows, Linux, the Android platform, huge positive is a lot more people are able to contribute to those communities because the rules are less restrictive, but then you often end with a product that's not nearly as polished. So I really think the open platforms are very important for those trying to get their feet wet in development and starting off some stuff, and then once you've kind of proven your idea, your proof of concept, then you might be good enough to get into Apple's good graces and let your app be on their app store or your software run on their operating system without a million warnings that it's unsafe.
I know, Ben, your wife, who's taught the little kids for a long time now, she'd be much kinder about this. But you need to go back to kindergarten and answer the question. You were given a clear choice: Apple or Mac or PC.
You could only pick one to take on a desert
You start talking about
island.
Linux and open source, and I mean that was not an option given. Don't you know that this is the straitjacket you've been put into?
If I have to choose, I'm going to go PC. I've just been using it longer, and I'm not a man of great wealth, so I like their price point a little better.
Well, anyone who knows me well knows I'm someone who is really interested in a good operating system for when I gigabyte my RAM in the middle of a nice backup of my CDR-W drive. Ben will know more than once he's got messages or texts or phone calls from me saying I think my computer died or something else is drastically wrong, and probably he feels like the tech support people that have to say, is it plugged in or did you turn it on? I will say I have been an Apple fanboy since about 2010 when I went to grad school and got the student discount to get a MacBook and then worked my way into iPhones. And part of that is with a family of 7 with 5 kids and my wife. Apple has a lot of nice things between the iPad and the iPhone and the iPods, if they do still exist, being able to communicate. My world was changed a bit recently, though, when Ben introduced me to Telegram, which can do much of the same thing in a kind of more exciting way. I know my son Nicholas, who's with us, likes to consider himself a connoisseur of, is it dank memes, Nicholas? And of things of that nature, but I think I'm becoming a bit of the, is it a GIF? Is that what you call it, gentlemen?
I've heard that it's officially GIF, but everybody says GIF, so I just go with either.
Nicholas, did you have a thought on memes? You got very excited when I said memes, and you've risen from your desk with great enthusiasm. Feel free to jump in.
I thought Nick was comatose, but he jumped up like a jackrabbit there.
My aim was to point out my father's error. It is pronounced GIF, in fact. But yes, I fear memes are becoming a bigger part of modern culture. It's more of a comedy now and I wouldn't say it's making anything better, but yes, it is becoming larger. It is, I fear, more important to the younger generation than other things, such as family, but
how much do you pay him, Wade? My goodness, he's laying it on thick for you.
Yeah, he is really extrapolating philosophically the influence that memes have had. I do think, given the dangers he's clearly explicated, perhaps this is another of those things the Russians might be behind, flooding us with memes to dull our thought. I will just say, though, as I was saying, with Apple being able to work together on all the things, Apple has been a big draw for me. But I haven't converted, but I have, like Ben mentioned, I've added to my arsenal a bit. Microsoft Surface Pro something, I don't even remember which kind, that I used at the end of last year and this year for grading, being able to mark up PDFs and then send the file back. And that has been a real benefit to me as someone who spends a lot of time. 4 of my classes right now are writing intensive, 30-some students in each when those papers come in. It's a lot of paper to carry around. Being able to have it on the computer, Google Drive, mark it up and send it back has been a good benefit. So I can see both sides. If I were put in the situation of I can only have one, being that I also am not a man of great wealth, I would probably go Apple and have to sell one of my children. Peter, why don't we've saved for you last. What are your thoughts on this one?
So I set the trap perfectly for Ben, and he fell right into it because as I tell, I think every class I've ever taught, I tell them when you're given a choice of 2, you always choose the third. Dichotomies are so rare, and yet that's how we always think. So what I trapped Ben, and he fell into it as a good dichotomous thinker.
Let the bird fly, Ben. Escape the snare.
That's right. I'm a Linux guy. I have Apple. I run PC for a lot of years.
That was my favorite Charlie Brown character, by the way, Ben Linux.
Ben
yes.
Linux. But I like it because of the open source, as Ben was talking about, and I find the open source community just terribly fascinating. And Ben talks about polish, and the problem with polish is it costs a lot. And when you start getting into the open source community and realize how much you can do for so little, you start realizing that the polish costs us a lot, and it also hamstrings us. So rise of the third world through Linux. That's my position.
Yeah, I was a big proponent of Linux a while back, but I still think it's great in concept. I just found it too much work to try to keep everything up to date and keep everything in sync with the stuff that I had to work with on a day-to-day basis for work purposes.
I've found myself technologically really just been surprised at the amount I can do with Microsoft Word. And with Google, I've really enjoyed those, and I think I've been very happy with those things. And when I'm done with this, I am going to Google about half of the words Peter and Ben said today, and then I am going to write them down in Microsoft Word so I can remember them for later. I think we'll wrap up the free-for-all with that. If you have any thoughts or questions, PC or Mac, Apple or Android, feel free to let us know. You can comment on Facebook at Just Let the Bird Fly, or through our website, hopefully soon, letthebirdfly.com, or email us at justletthebirdfly@gmail.com, which is our email address we'll be using for now. And with that, we will make our way to our main topic. Our main topic, once again, for the day is stepping outside the fortress. And just to give a little bit of background on this, the three of us gathered in the room are all members. I think Ben and Peter, if I'm not mistaken, lifetime members. Myself, since about my senior year of high school, a member of what we would call confessional Lutheran church bodies. And if you wonder what is a confessional Lutheran, imagine kind of someone who takes the Bible seriously, but is afraid to talk about it too much. The confessional Lutheran is someone who holds, though, to the Lutheran confessions. There's 6 of them, and they subscribe or hold to them in a way that says they do truly, in all their parts, explain the teachings of the Scripture. But one of the things that's fascinating for me with this topic is someone who has now served as a pastor for about, this is bad, maybe 13 years. I was ordained July 18th of 2004. I'm trying to do the math in my head, but I haven't had math since high school. So you can do the math for me if you would like. But as someone who has served in that church body and was educated in college and seminary in a confessional Lutheran church body that was heavily influenced by German thought, one of the things I think that can sometimes happen is we like to think in systems and systematically, and I think Peter can correct me, but I think this is something the Germans like to do in philosophy in general too. You have a system of thought, of a totality, and so there can be this great skepticism. If someone is wrong on one thing, or if their system is wrong, perhaps there's nothing that can be gained or learned from them. And so I think especially for us, it's helpful to talk a little bit about stepping outside the fortress. And I don't mean by this we should read a bunch of Drek or roll around in the gutter, but recognizing that there are a lot of wonderful insights out there that can be gained, but also we can learn the questions that have been asked and are being asked by others so that we can better have conversations with them and benefit ourselves by, it's not my spiritual gift, but I do it sometimes, listening. And so with that in mind, I thought I would maybe let Peter jump in here and give us a little bit of a background of maybe a thinker or two that he stepped out of the fortress and engaged in, and maybe it's sharpened his own mind. Maybe it's led him to ask some big questions for himself or to realize some of the big questions others are asking. And in general, he's found maybe not helpful in every way, and I think he has one example that he may not find right in everything, but he is still found useful. So, Peter, have at it, my friend.
Yeah, the way that I found I talked about this, I believe, in the first episode, but the way I found myself pursuing philosophy in graduate school was I studied theology in undergrad and then philosophy in a little bit, and said, I really like this and it would be helpful with my theological training, so I decided to go on to graduate school. Well, at that point I would say that I was a pretty clear-cut Platonist. I loved Plato. He was great. I felt like I could just spend my whole life, the rest of my life, mining the depths of Plato, and I would be happy. I got to graduate school and very quickly became enamored with some postmodern thoughts, and before everyone turns off the podcast, quick, don't turn it off.
I do want to summarize, though, Peter. I taught Western Civ in Michigan for a while before I came here to the college, and I did have a student once on Western Civ on a test who spelled Plato, P-L-A-T-O, Play-Doh, and answered an essay question entirely about the toy Plato. So unless there's any confusion, Plato, Greek philosopher, has a lot of metaphysics, right?
Yes.
Deep spiritual thought.
Not as much fun for children as Play-Doh, but for adults, well, at least it's some fun for some adults. Maybe not as much fun as Plato, even there. No, but I got into postmodern thought, and so some people might be cringing because postmodern thought can be quite frightening and oftentimes quite meaningless. But I started seeing some connections, and I started pursuing them. And then I wanted to say, well, how can I be interested in postmodernism when I was interested in Plato? He's an ancient, Greek philosopher. And I started looking at what connects them. So, just go, about 2,500 years of thinkers to go through. And I landed on one thinker that struck me, someone that I didn't think that I would enjoy, that I think would get much out of, and it's Martin Heidegger. Heidegger is early 20th century thinker in Germany, and he's in the early part of the field of phenomenology. So if you know anything about that, you already know about Heidegger, I'm sure. But he's an interesting character. But he has this neat connection with some of the things that we talked about a couple episodes about Kierkegaard, and so I just want to walk through some of that and just demonstrate how I find it interesting. But first, let me give you a little background on Heidegger. When you read Heidegger, you might come across a passage that reads something like this: "Death is Dasein's ownmost possibility. Being towards this possibility discloses to Dasein its ownmost potentiality for being." And for the record, potentiality for being in my translation is hyphenated. "In which its very being is the issue. Here it can become manifest to Dasein, that in this distinctive possibility of its own self," and so on and so forth. What does that mean? I'm not even sure. The point is, you read something like this and you think, this guy's crazy. Or, at best, I'm not interested in trying to figure out what he's saying. But you dig a little deeper, and you start realizing, oh, wait, maybe there is something here. But then you run into problems with his personal life. Heidegger was member of the Nazi Party. In the
Why was that a problem,
1930s.
Peter? I'm just joking. I just want to broaden our audience. I'd like to welcome our listeners from the alt-right. We're glad to have you with us today at Let the Bird Fly. I am joking, but if you would like to get upset about that, I also welcome our listeners from the left. Please don't punch me. I know it's a big debate. Is it all right to punch Nazis? But we will get back to Heidegger. Nazism is bad. Don't be a Nazi. And Peter, you may keep going, please.
Yeah. So my point is there's a lot of reasons to not, really like Heidegger and to maybe say I'm not even going to worry about him. But then you get into this interesting construction that he creates, and you see this connection to, like I said, to Kierkegaard, before. He talks about this Dasein, this being, in the conceptual sense, leading towards death, and then this being towards death that leads towards anxiety, and this anxiety then leads towards guilt. And you should start hearing being reminiscent of our discussion of Kierkegaard with anxiety and dread, what Heidegger is driving at, I believe, is that this is how we find ourselves. Now Heidegger goes a very different direction from Kierkegaard. Ultimately, he's pointing at something different, but he drives to the same. He comes to this kind of same conclusion that guilt is at the heart of our authentic being, as he would say. And just one quick quote to kind of drive at that. He says, "All experiences and interpretations of the conscience are at one in that they make the voice of conscience speak somehow of guilt." Now, guilt, we talked about in our human condition episode, is kind of at the heart of the human condition. And so all of a sudden we come to Heidegger, the Nazi, the guy who writes in this crazy cryptic language, and we see he's asking the same the same questions, the same issues, and so there's something that we can pull from that. At least I can, and it broadens my understanding. So we're stepping outside the fortress. We're getting to this point where we're saying, hey, maybe there's something that's someone outside of my castle, which is important. The fortress is very important. It protects us and it keeps us safe, but that doesn't mean the world's bigger than that. And so that's a long-winded way, I guess, of pointing in the philosophical direction how I found myself reading people that I thought had nothing to say to me.
You mentioned the fortress is good and it keeps us safe, and I think that's a great point. But also the value of stepping out. It reminded me a little bit of a story. My dissertation worked a lot with the city of Magdeburg right after Martin Luther's death, and the city of Magdeburg in Germany was laid under siege by the emperor after he kind of made his way back into Germany and was trying to move the Lutheran churches back to Catholicism. And who knows if it's true or not. The basic test as a historian I like to use is if I like the story or not. But there are accounts that some of the soldiers of Magdeburg would go outside the fortress dressed as women. And some of the Spanish soldiers supposedly would get there weren't a lot of women in camp, and so they would figure out, hey, we'll go talk to these women or whatever the case may be. And then they would cut down the Spaniards and run triumphantly back into the city. So good things can happen when you step outside the fortress. It's nothing against Spaniards or anything of that sort, but kind of the value of both, as Peter mentioned. And I think Heidegger is fascinating, as we mentioned with Kierkegaard. These are questions people ask as they wrestle with who am I, or questions of being. And we all probably ask them in middle school to some extent. Who am I? Am I the things I like? Am I my view of who I think I am, or the things I do? But perhaps maybe some of us, we grow out of those questions too quickly and fail to kind of maybe dig deep and think them through, as even Solomon himself did in Ecclesiastes. And along those lines, I'd like to first see, Peter, if there's anything else directly right now you'd like to bring up on Heidegger before I maybe jump into a little bit of what I've appreciated by stepping outside the fortress.
No, I think I've butchered Heidegger enough. We'll let him lie.
Well, excellent. He was your Spaniard today.
Yes.
I suppose, as he went outside the fortress to butcher Heidegger. One of the things that I enjoyed reading, and I'm going to sound a little bit like a high schooler, maybe who is going through the emotions of that. But I early on I really appreciated enjoyed the fiction of Jack Kerouac. It's kind of a fun thing. You're on the road and all these things are happening. You're working through these experiences. But one of the things that Kerouac did for me is he's this fascinating figure who always wants to kind of at the end return to his good old French Catholicism, but is enamored with Buddhism and is just in love with the people he meets as he travels, wrestles with alcoholism, things of this nature. But he has a couple scenes in his book sometimes where someone just gets to a point, he describes a scene, and it just sinks in for the person, why does any of this matter? Just kind of the empty feeling that can set in. And in one of the scenes, I would get in trouble for sharing on the podcast, so I won't. But it ties into, I think, some of the value in philosophy when I have my students look at existentialism and the existentialists. I like to sometimes ask people, and maybe I'll ask you first, Peter, before I get into this. If you weren't a Christian, so Christianity is out the window and it's not a possibility, right? There is no God, or at least not the Christian God. I'm guessing your first inclination would be to go with Team True God, whoever that is. What philosophy do you think you'd find? What school, if there is a school or mixture, do you think you'd find yourself in?
Well, I think I'd probably fall back into my old ways and look at Platonism and Neoplatonism.
Still want hope.
And, yeah, always looking for hope, right? What's that St. Peter tells us? Always be ready with an answer for the hope you have in you. But yeah, I think that's probably where I would go. But part of the reason for that, I think, is that I see so much that I can understand. I can use a Neoplatonistic lens to understand Christianity in a deeper way, which is not to say that Christianity is inherently Neoplatonistic, if that's a word, but rather that Neoplatonism helps me to better understand the mysteries of my own faith.
Yeah, Very interesting. I think it maybe shows something with my personality that I jump right into the giving up of all hope. And I think I probably would fall into existentialism or nihilism, probably find myself with Nietzsche or Sartre, Camus, not Kierkegaard. He has too much hope, even as he has sorrow and dread. Maybe Heidegger, but I'm kind of distancing myself from the whole Nazi thing at this point for fear of being labeled. But one of the
Wade's been getting hate tweets while we cover this for his defense of Nazism.
I would if I could figure out how to use Twitter. That's something for another episode. That's the one social media platform I just cannot figure out. Otherwise, then I know a lot of people are angry on it. But I think existentialism would be somewhat attractive to me. In philosophy and ethics, we've been reading some novels this year, and we just recently read The Stranger by Albert Camus, which is kind of a book that French students will read in their equivalent of high school, and you can picture kind of the high school boy reading it and being drawn into it. But really, it's a story about a guy trying to own his being, right? To just be. And I think it has perhaps my favorite opening and closing lines to a novel. It starts Maman, which is mom, so I'm going to say mom because America. Mom died today, or yesterday maybe. I don't know. And it closes with these words: I had only to wish that there be a large crowd of spectators the day of my execution, and that they greet me with cries of hate. It's this story of this man that just doesn't seem to care much about anything. His girlfriend asks if he wants to marry her, and he says sure. And she says, well, do you love me? And he says, well, probably not, but if you want to get married, we'll get married. And he kind of just goes with the flow. And the question of, well, is he going to own it? And when he gets the chance to own it is after he's been put on trial for murder, but the trial is really for him not being caught up in being all the things society expects us to be. And so he owns his execution, this great act of rebellion. And I think I'd probably maybe find myself falling into kind of the being drawn to the hopelessness of that. I think Sartre, if I'm not mistaken, said his thought was kind of just logically thinking through a consistent atheism. And I don't know that means Sartre was an unhappy man or that an existentialist needs to be unhappy. But I'm always fascinated by reading those things and realizing when people think this through, where is meaning? Is there meaning? What is the good life? As Nietzsche would ask, are there morals? Nietzsche's always just a great game changer. And where does that leave you? And so I usually do a little bit of a bit in class. Peter, you can probably guess where this is going, about Sartre and Nietzsche working a suicide hotline. And I usually do it at the point that Sartre talks about that a soldier might be drafted into a war. If I'm getting the story wrong, let me know. I believe it's Freedom and Responsibility. A soldier is drafted into a war. And if he goes, he can't say, I didn't choose this, because everything is a choosing, and he could have always killed himself. And so in class, I like to say, imagine Sartre working a suicide hotline, and someone calls and says, my life isn't going well, and it's not my fault. All these things have just happened to me. And if Sartre said, well, have you thought about killing yourself? And well, that's why I'm calling, or them calling, and saying the same to Nietzsche. And he says, you are weak, you bloodless bourgeois bureaucrat. But this kind of just laying bare of things that I think happens in that thought. And the weakness of that is that it probably misses a lot that Peter would get to appreciate and enjoy with Plato. But I think it's such an interesting perspective into what people are wrestling with. We're getting deep into philosophy here. Ben, you got any good fart jokes that you'd like to share at this point?
No, sorry. Maybe a little less philosophical, but as you are discussing this, it's really making me think about this bigger topic of stepping outside the fortress. And then, we Christians, as we work with others in the world, maybe even other Christians who are at different places in their faith life, maybe than we are, or whatever the case may be, a young Christian, a new Christian, the whole idea of when should we encourage people to go outside the fortress, or are there times where they need to stay in the fortress for a little bit to get the background that they need, so they can go out and have answers to some of these questions that come from outside the fortress. I've talked to several parents of school-age kids, and it's very fascinating to me. I'm not suggesting any kind of an answer to this or a best way to do it, but some parents have said, I really want my kid to be out in, a difficult situation because that's where they can be salt and light, even as young people. And other parents would say, I want them to do that too, but they're not ready for that. They need to have that robust background first, so then that when that comes. So, as you talk about this, it kind of reminded me with the suicide hotline thing. I probably wouldn't. Somebody who's really struggling with their faith and wrestling with questions of these, it might not be appropriate to have them dig in. But at the same time, still things to discuss with them and learn from these people.
I think that's a great point, Ben, and I think we're probably in a room of people who appreciate the liberal arts, and myself teaching at a liberal arts college. I think that hopefully is what drives Christians founding schools and colleges, that we're laying the foundation for them, that hopefully there's the catechesis, and then teaching them to be able to wrestle with some of the other questions and things like that will come out into the world. But I think you make a great point of the danger. If we're failing at catechesis, the last thing we want to do is to send people into authors and to thinkers that are going to ask questions they themselves haven't learned to ask or to address. And if you think about the catechism, what it really is questions and answers. Here are the questions you should ask, and here are some answers to that. And I think I would briefly say that, especially I think for stepping outside the fortress, I would have in mind our pastors and our teachers we're at the point in society now where the pastor isn't necessarily the most educated guy in the parish and isn't the most educated guy in the town, and we can't just fall back on, well, I'm the pastor and I said it. And I think probably more important than ever before, it's important for us to be reading, to be ready to engage these other thoughts without just dismissing them, because our people are going to be doing that, and when they come to us, to be able to do so. And hopefully some well-trained laity, too, that can give the reason for the hope that they have as they understand where someone else is coming from. But yeah, someone struggling with depression, probably not going to give them Sartre or Camus, probably not Nietzsche, and maybe even, as much as I enjoy some of his writings, maybe even not Kierkegaard. Peter, would you give him Plato?
I'd give him Plato, yeah. No, and I just want to say, Wade, one of the things that I agree and with what you're saying, but I will say one of the advantages of someone like a Nietzsche, for instance, is that if a person is in the right place and is mature enough, has the foundation laid to approach someone like Nietzsche and see that look into that vast emptiness of nihilism, they would also understand they would also understand then where people are coming from. So we've got people in the world that are wrestling with these things that Nietzsche's wrestling with, that that Sartre's wrestling with, and having the exposure for a well catechized lay person to these is it's a huge benefit to them then to be able to approach them as, if I tie it back to our scripture lesson today, it's as Paul in the Areopagus, right? Being able to say, hey, I get it, I see where you're coming from. Let me explain why you could have hope. Let me explain to you why nihilism, although it seems very compelling as a 17-year-old dour high school student, is really kind of misses the main point, something that's really important.
And I think with that too, Peter, you make a great point too. Not only going into the Areopagus just to convert, or meeting with our friends and talking about these things just to convert, but also to enjoy good conversation. You look at some of the greatest,
Amen.
The greatest authors or philosophers, and they were people who loved to have a conversation. And I think that's just a wonderful gift to be enjoyed, a conversation like we're having around the table today. I guess the closest I can compare it to, I think most of us in the room here have studied languages, whether it be Ben and Peter and I coming up through school. I know Peter's German is probably much better than my own, but we both worked with that. But even the children here, having lived in Europe, in the Netherlands, and then traveled in Germany, having to pick up bits. When you learn another language, I think it makes you better at your own language too. When I study German or Latin, I also have to learn how German or Latin speakers think, right? Latin speakers don't think so much anymore as they're dead. But you're also learning how to think, and you come back to your own language with wonderful insights. And so I think that's something we can do as we step outside the fortress to not only benefit our neighbor in doing so, but also to grow in what we've learned inside the fortress as well, to learn to better appreciate our own language. And so, Peter or Ben, anything you have for us before we're going to end the conversation for today? Well, with that in mind, as we appreciate both the fortress and the ability to step outside as we do so, I suppose there's only really one thing we could do, and that would be...
Let the bird fly!
Every evening when the sun goes down, get with my party and I begin to cry. I don't care what the people are thinking.